Hello, and welcome to today's special webinar event on database threats, preventing the worst with zero trust data management. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media. I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. And now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things you should know about this webinar. First off, we want this to be a very educational event for you, so we encourage any and all questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. Second, I want to call your attention to the handout section of your webinar control panel. You'll find that we're offering links to several great resources. There's a Gartner Magic Quadrant, a guide to rapid ransomware recovery and cyber resiliency, a white paper on modern data protection for databases, and a 20 questions guide for modernizing backup. We also have links to several Actual Tech Media resources, our Gorilla Guide book club, and a link to the ATM Event Center. Be sure to click on those and share them with friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar event, we'll be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. If you're watching this webinar on demand, I'm sorry, the drawing has already occurred. If you are the winner, you can choose to donate the value of that gift card to one of our selected charities. Thanks to generous prize winners on previous Actual Tech Media events, thousands of dollars have been donated to charity, so thank you in advance if you make that choice today. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found at actualtechmedia.com. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. And finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. To help encourage you to get your fingers off of your coffee cup and onto your keyboard, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's great content. It's an honor to introduce you to today's presenters. We have Shawn McElhinney, who's Solutions Architect at Rubrik, specializing in the Oracle database. And we have Chris Lumnah, Solutions Architect at Rubrik for Microsoft SQL Server. So Shawn and Chris, welcome. And Shawn, let me turn things over to you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Scott. I appreciate the time. Shawn McElhinney, as we mentioned earlier, Solution Architect specializing in Oracle here at Rubrik. Been a DBA for about 25 years working in the Oracle space. Also spent a considerable amount of time working in the security realm, have earned my CISSP and CCSP. So I have a pretty good handle on databases and the security around them. So hopefully we'll be able to share some knowledge with you here and get you up to speed on some of the features that Rubrik has to offer to help you along. Chris, turn it over to you for a quick minute so you can give an introduction.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Lumnah. I am a SQL Server Solutions Architect with Rubrik. I've been with Rubrik now for just under 4 years. It'll be 4 years in January. But before that, I spent the previous 15 years as a production DBA, working my way up from the junior DBA all the way up to a team lead, and even done some consulting work along the way as well. Before that, I started off as a developer. So a lot of my bad habits got fixed when I became a DBA, and I used a lot of that development work to make things better when I became a DBA.
I don't know, some developers on the call may say you went to the dark side, but.
Yep.
All right. So let's get started. You guys know the presentation we're doing, talking about preventing the worst with zero trust data management. So we won't spend much time here. What are we going to talk about? So we got a big problem out there. Fact of the matter is companies need to prevent every exploit that's coming at them. But an attacker really only has to be able to take advantage of a single exploit to be successful. So when we look at that, we have to figure out, is there a solution to really help combat it? And do we have policies, processes, and procedures that should be assessed to really help us overcome this? And ideally, once we've identified the solutions, what do we really need to focus on to address the problem? Now, the past 2 years have really showed us how critical data is to business activities and how susceptible it is to attack. Security researchers have said for years that two types of organizations really exist: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. And the fact of the matter is that defense in depth really doesn't stop everything. And lastly, our technical solutions can really only go so far. They're dependent on human interaction for data input, for analysis, and for maintenance. The fact of the matter is that humans make mistakes, unless of course they're DBAs, because we're perfect. So what do we really need to do to fix this fundamental issue? Some of the best ways to address the problem are implementing a zero trust framework through the data lifecycle, implementing mitigation plans, and ultimately generating security at the point of data. Now, let's talk a little more about this with our focus in three primary areas: proactive mitigation, insurance, or what you can term, like CYA mitigation, and reactive mitigation. So let's start with proactive mitigation. So proactive mitigation really focuses our efforts on tasks that can be done to prevent an attack from being successful. This isn't a simple activity, really, when it comes to database threats, as it can span multiple areas. Our infrastructure, authentication, authorization, data lifecycle, application design and usage. These are some of the big things that we really have to contend with. So, Chris, can you explain what companies should be focusing on in order to maximize their security?
Sure. So let's start off with infrastructure. This is going to be the foundation of everything that database administrators or application users are going to use. Everything sits here first. It sits on the hardware. So BIOS firmware is a lot of times often forgotten about because there's no nice little notification from the operating system or anything that tells you, hey, we have a new patch for your BIOS or your firmware for your hardware. So you have to stay on top of that. You have to be on their websites, constantly checking to make sure that you have the latest version with the latest security updates. These firmware and BIOS updates always patch low-level exploits that hackers like to use to get in and exploit and then do bad things to your underlying environment. The operating system itself is another crucial area that we need to make sure is fully patched. Vendors like Microsoft and are constantly doing exercises where they're doing red team, blue team exercises, where you have a red team trying to do penetration and trying to break the operating system, and the blue team trying to do defense, and making sure that any hole or exploit that is found is then quickly documented, understood, and then closed before it can be used out in the real world. They also will run bug bounty programs, so this way the field and users in the field can actually find these programs and report them back to the vendor and take advantage of that, so they can get those exploits closed as quickly as possible. And you can make some money off it. Great. But ultimately, all of these are to close exploits in the operating system, and companies like Microsoft or other operating system vendors will release patches at least monthly, but a lot of times security updates will come out a little bit quicker or a little sooner than the normal monthly patching cycle that comes out. The hypervisor is also a very important place to consider patching. VMware recently had an exploit that affected vSphere environments. VMware worked very, very fast to find and get that hole closed as soon as possible. And they also were giving workarounds to say, hey, if you have this, here's the workaround, put this in place right now, and we'll get you a hole or a patch to close that hole as soon as we can. And they did it very, very fast. This also has to be looked at and maintained and and work through. The database platform is the other area that we also have to worry about. I know for SQL Server and with Microsoft, they switched everything over to cumulative updates. And every month they have a cumulative update that comes out that includes all fixes to the normal database platform. It'll also include security updates. But there's also their out-of-band security updates that will come out as well that closes up holes that they find that are coming out with just the specific database platform itself. So at all these individual layers, you have to make sure you stay on top of these patches to make sure that you have the latest security updates that are being applied there to close any of these security patches or security holes that are out there.
Okay, so based on what you're telling me here, Chris, it looks like there's just a massive amount of patching that we need to make sure we're staying on top of.
Oh, yes.
Let's face it, a lot of companies out there have a limited set of resources, and it may be hard to stay on top of this. So how should they be prioritizing their patching efforts?
Well, that's going to depend on individual environments and what the patch is ultimately going to go through and do. Obviously, you don't want to just throw a patch out into production without testing it first. So getting it out into a test environment first will be the first step to securing the environment. Once you've done some testing there, then start to roll it out to the production environment afterwards. But ultimately, look at what the patch is doing and then get it applied as soon as you can based on the importance of that particular patch.
Okay, so really knowing what to patch and when to patch it is great. But what do we need to do to make sure that we've got the correct person performing the activities?
A lot of that's going to come down to separation of duties. And the next thing with authentication. So first, when you have any type of authentication into your environment, you should be using multi-factor authentication to get into your environment. Now, that multi-factor authentication is three things, or something you know, something you have, something you are. Something you know is your password or a PIN number. Something you have is your smartphone or your USB key, something that gives you those one-time passwords that you can use in addition to the something you know. And the something you have, or I'm sorry, something you are, is the fingerprint or facial recognition. So like your iPhone, that you can use Face ID to get into your phone. That's an additional method of getting into your phone other than just the PIN number that you use. If you're using any of these types of forms of MFA, you also want to make sure that you don't want to use SMS text messages as a way to get that one-time password, because you can very easily spoof a phone so I can intercept that text message and now you don't get it and I can go ahead and use it and get into your system that way. Not the best thing you want to use. From a password storage perspective, never store your password in plain text. This is obvious. You don't want to put it into a script file. You don't want to have it in a database as a plain text version of the password. Make sure it's hashed and make sure it's encrypted so this way no one can go ahead and use and just go randomly look inside a file or randomly look inside of a database and get that particular password out. From a password policy perspective, consider going length over complexity. Okay, longer passwords are actually going to be more complex and more difficult for a password cracker to break over complexity. The reason for that is that with complexity, a lot of times the user is going to go ahead and create passwords like password 123, and that password pattern will end up being a capital P with the lowercase, the rest of the word 123, and then maybe an exclamation point. Password crackers understand these types of patterns. They'll already have these built in. When you combine that with periodic resets, the user is going to go from password 123 exclamation point to password 123 @ or £, changing it ever so slightly where, yes, they met the criteria of the periodic reset policy, but it's still simple because users don't want to remember these long, complex passwords. The other thing you want to do for your passwords is have them be compared against a breach password list. If that password is sitting on that breach password list, don't allow it to be used, because now that you're opening up a hole to get into your environment because a password that was known to have been breached is being used in the wild. Tokens and certificates should be treated like passwords. Tokens being API tokens, things that you're going to use to get into a particular box, like an SSH key or an API token. These are all used often, and if they're not expired, or if they're put in plain text, or they're hard-coded, all just create additional vulnerabilities in the application environment where anyone can just go grab the key and then start using them. If you hard code the API key or the token into your code, now making that change when it expires makes it very difficult to go ahead and change. Where if it's sitting outside and it's secured and it's hashed and it's used, then it can be much more secure in utilizing that API token. And then, of course, always use HTTPS to send that data across the network, especially if you're doing anything on the internet.
All right. So, assuming that we follow the standards you've referenced here, once we authenticate, we should be able to do whatever we want, right?
Well, not exactly. That's when the privileges of people have to be looked at. So, with everything, the least permission possible to do the job requested, that policy, that mindset needs to be used. If you're giving elevated access, who are you giving elevated access to? Is it a trusted individual? And what does that trusted individual have the ability to do? Does that person have the ability to change data? Should they? If they're an admin, what level do they need admin or root access to do their particular job? Can you strip the permissions back to only give them the tasks or the permissions they needed to do the task at hand? If you're looking at the next step from there, so you have the excessive privileges because you just granted privileges that were too high for the task being required. You also have the opposite of that, or the adjacent to that, which is the abusive privileges, where you have a rogue admin who is just very disgruntled and says, I'm going to do a bad thing today. I'm going to start deleting backups. I'm going to start deleting data. I'm going to start doing bad things in the environment. Well, to prevent against rogue admins, do you want to go ahead and maybe have it as a two-person job to do certain types of activities, like deleting backups or data or anything else? Another abuse of privileges is old access. And what I mean by that is I start off in one position in a company, and I go off and move over to another position in a company. Well, that my access is still there. I still can do the things I used to do in my old position that I shouldn't be able to do in my new position. That permission never gets cleaned up. Additionally, you have user accounts or service accounts that are no longer used, or the person has left the company entirely, and they're still in the database or they're still in the application, still able to do the things that need to do. They're not cleaned up, which means someone who knows that user ID, knows that password, can go in and do things that they shouldn't be able to do under their normal circumstances. You're not revoking those permissions to prevent any type of action like that from the using of those old accounts. Abandoned privileges are another thing too. Again, it's a cleanup issue. You have users that are still active that have moved on or not in the same role anymore, and they still can do the things that they used to be able to do before, and could do bad things. Or someone could get their account and make some bad changes in the environment under that old access that person has. And again, users who left the company, that's another thing that has to be looked at as well. Are you cleaning them up, removing them from Active Directory groups, so this way they can't access things that they used to be able to access?
Okay, well, it really sounds like you're creating a lot more work for me as a DBA. I mean, at the end of the day, my job is to keep the database online and processing as quickly as possible. isn't security falling in somebody else's purview?
No. The single biggest role that the DBA has is actually data protection. That means making sure that you have backups, making sure that things are in a secure way, not having anyone who has access to that database get access to that database who shouldn't. And it should be done in conjunction with the security teams, the infrastructure teams, the other members of IT. It's not just the DBA who has to do all of this work. It's working together with those other groups. Now, with all of that, you also have to know where data lives. And what I mean by that is how many copies of a database are out there. Backups actually count. So think about your environment. You have that order entry database sitting in your environment. You have it in production. You've got backups of that production database. You also probably have a copy of that database sitting in a non-production environment. How many non-production environments is that database sitting in? UAT, QA, dev, whatever the name of the non-production environment is. Think about that. Where are your backups stored? Are they stored in multiple places? Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have multiple copies of the database and multiple copies of the backup, but it's being mindful of it to know where they all are in case something bad was to happen. Can you pull your backup from a local site versus an offsite if a disaster strikes? If you're thinking about the internals of a database, how many copies of a table are sitting inside that database? And what I mean by that is that DBAs tend to have this habit of, I'm going to make a change to this table, but before I make the change to the table, I'm going to do a backup of the table. Make complete sense. Then they forget to clean up the table. So they have the actual production table, then they have the same table as copy with the date. And then they forgot to delete that table just because they were off doing other more important types of tasks that they needed to get to. If you're talking about your data inside your databases and inside your tables, what sensitive data exists there? Do you know if you are storing credit card numbers or social security numbers or personal identifiable information, health records, or whatever the case may be? Do you know where it exists? Do you know if it exists in a flat file outside of the database? Do you know if it exists in a spreadsheet outside of the database? Remember that the most widely used database in the world is Excel. It's because everyone goes ahead and extracts their data into Excel, and then they go and do a bunch of stuff with the data so they can make their reports and do their tasks. So those are all additional copies of the data that needs to be thought about and cared for. From a storage media perspective, who's got access to the database files? Well, if you think about who's got access to the actual server itself, anybody who's got access to the server generally has access to the files. What can they do with those files? Are they properly secured so I can't, as a rogue admin, go in there and drop a file, delete a file that needs to be there? What about my backups? Who's got access to those? Is that the same number of people that have access to the database files or to the data itself? Should they be the same sets of people? Who's got access to delete the data? That's another important thing, because your deletion of data, which is a normal application task, should be done via the application, not through someone doing an ad hoc SSMS query that could potentially do something worse than what they're expecting. For instance, I know I've done it. I know other DBAs have done it. I know other people who are looking at data have done it. They've gone ahead and wrote a query that was great. They went and ran it, but they forgot to highlight the where clause. So now, instead of just dealing with the small subset of data that they were expecting to deal with, they just deleted the entire contents of a table. It wasn't done on purpose, it was done by accident, but it's still something to think about. Who has physical access to storage? Who can walk into your data center, walk up to the array, grab a disk and walk out with it, and then go read the data wherever they want if they have that access? Where are you placing your data? Think about that. Should internally used data be sitting near externally used data? What I mean specifically is think about a database server that's sitting in the DMZ. There's obviously a reason to have it there for security reasons and for application reasons, but the data that's there should be isolated to that particular application. Should HR or other secret sauce data that's sitting inside of the firewall be out there as well? Should it be accessible? Should it be isolated off? Most likely, yes.
Okay, so from a security perspective, I mean, there's three main pillars to security, which are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Is it accurate to say that DBAs ultimately are responsible for maintaining those pillars across the entire data lifecycle?
They are, but not alone. Again, they should be working with the other aspects of, or the other team members of IT, the security team, the infrastructure team, to make sure that they're doing the best to secure the data.
Okay, and the big question spawning out of that is, what about the access points that DBAs have no control over, like the applications that generate and manipulate the data we're protecting?
That's when working with the other teammates of IT are going to come into play. Working with the developers who are of those applications to, one, put in good practices on the development side. Because I've always said to, whenever I've been interviewed for a role and I got asked for, can you be this database developer? I'm like, well, the skill set, the focus of the skill set is different. Developers tend to really know how to make a database work really well and do all the things to make the application well. And production DBAs are much more focused on securing and protecting and making sure things run really well inside of that application stack and dealing with it there. And a lot of times they don't talk. They need to talk because the transfer of knowledge between the two will help ultimately make the application much, much better and much more secure. Additionally, and I'm going to say something that I never thought I would say myself as a DBA, work with auditors. The auditors come in, whether it be internal or external, they're there to do one job, and that's to protect the data that's inside the company. It was always a huge pain for me whenever I had to deal with an auditor because I'm guilty of it. I took the stance of, I know how to do my job. I'm following best practices. I don't need them to tell me how to do my job. That's not what they're there for. They actually are there to have the same goal as you to make sure the data is secure. And maybe they're going to highlight something from the previous slides about excessive privileges or privileges that are being assigned to someone or some service account that aren't used anymore, that just needs to be cleaned up. Well, guess what? It doesn't fall on the DBA specifically to make all those changes. A lot of times they need to be highlighted by the DBA. The DBA has already raised the red flag before, but now you have an auditor comes in and says, hey, these things need to be fixed. You can use the auditors as that hammer to help you get those changes pushed through. Work with them. Now, as far as application usage in general, think about doing things like data masking and row-level security. Meaning, with SQL Server, I know you can actually put in row-level security, so this way, depending on who you are, you can't see every row in the table. If you're using data masking, you can hide content like a credit card number or a social security number or whatever value that you want. Think about not putting things into clear text, so this way, it can't just be easily viewed just by doing a select star in your table. From a database injection perspective, how is the application talking to the database? Are they using direct queries? Are they using stored procedures? In which case, if you're using stored procedures, you can only do what the stored procedure is allowed to do. And otherwise, if you're using direct queries, that could potentially be hijacked with SQL injection. So keep that in mind. From a permissions perspective, is the application using a elevated permission set, or should it only be given the procedures or the execution of certain specific queries that the application needs? Think about that.
Okay. And you had mentioned, about auditing as we started off on this slide. Um, are we talking about working with like an internal audit team or external advisory teams that come in for annual inspections?
Both. I can't tell you how many times I've had to work with my own internal security teams, as well as companies like PwC who've come in and said, you need to fix all of these things. And then I got to start doing all that work to make things tighter and make things more secure in the environment. Again, they're on the same team as you, and they're doing the same thing that you're trying to do, but they're coming at it from a different angle.
Okay. And I always remember from my experience with audits that they're pretty stressful situations. Should I only be trying to work with these guys during an audit activity, or should I be expanding the scope?
The external audit guys, you're most likely only going to work with them when they're there, because otherwise they're not in your office. They're not going to be scanning your environment when they're not there. However, your internal teams are there, and they are constantly looking for things. And if you see an issue, say something and work with them to figure out what the best course of action is going forward. Now, while auditors are there and they're on the same team as you, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything they say has to be done exactly how they say it. They're going based on a best practice list. You're going based on your experience with the application. Have that calm conversation with them that says, you want me to do this, but if I do this, it will break this. How do I meet in the middle to make sure that I don't break application functionality, but still closing the gap that I need to, that is being highlighted by them? And if it's not something that you can do, because in the role of the DBA, you don't have the ability to make application level changes, that's when you have to bring in those development teams or those other IT teams to help you close that hole.
And through all that, that's how we're creating that proactive team to try to mitigate a lot of the issues that we've presented thus far, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And based on that, now we can start looking at the concept of our insurance policy, right? What do we know what we need to do to try to limit our attack surface area, and what do we need to do to ensure our downtime is limited in the event of a successful attack? So if we think about what an insurance policy is in its most basic form, it's really designed to protect us against certain risks. Proactive mitigation is the equivalent of, say, having an insurance inspector review your property and tell you what you need to fix in order to maintain your coverage. But the fact of the matter is, someone inevitably will get hurt on your property. Your insurance policy is going to cover you when somebody falls down the back stairs of your house. Chris, can you give us some details on a critical type of insurance that every company should really carry?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing is you need backups. And keep in mind that backups are there not just to protect you from the bad hacker coming in and doing something bad. It's also going to protect you from the human mistake. I mentioned earlier, I've done it. I know Shawn's done it. Anybody who's a DBA who's got experience has done this in the past, and they've made a mistake where they shouldn't have run that one line of code, but they did, and it broke something in the environment. Any DBA who's got experience has done it because that's how they get the experience. So having a way to recover from that is important, and DBAs are going to be able to recover from things based on their backups. Now, one thing I want to stress here, you don't want a backup strategy. You want a recovery strategy. You want to think about the things that are going to happen to your environment and figure out how should you recover from those types of things. Are you recovering an entire system? Are you recovering a database? Are you recovering a table? Well, each one of those requires a different way to back up that particular environment. Think about what the business wants from an RPO perspective. If they tell you that they want zero data loss, okay, fine. Take that, research it out, and then show them what the bill is for zero data loss. If they're okay with that cost, then put the solution in that fits the zero data loss requirement that the business has. A lot of times when you start to do this research and you figure out, oh man, to do zero data loss for this application, I need to have this many servers and these many places, and I need to have availability groups, and I need to have really low transaction log backups, and all these things, it all costs additional money, licensing fees, hardware fees, time, resources, as well as the people knowledge to know how to manage it all. If they're not okay with paying that bill, then start to think back, okay, what's your real accepted amount of data loss? And then start to come up with a solution to fit that. Once you have your recovery strategy and you start to put in your plan to say, okay, to be able to do a recovery of this particular environment, I need to do these things. I start to put my backups in to meet that recovery strategy. Then you have to do some testing. Does the backups that you're doing meet the recovery strategy that you're putting in place based on your business requirements? If yes, great. If not, make some changes and keep iterating on it. But one and done is not good enough. You should not be doing this once to prove the case out and then calling it a and moving on to some other task in the environment. You have to do this repetitively. Databases grow. Environments change. Your runbook should change with it, because as your data grows, the time it takes to do a backup, the time it takes to do a restore, the time it takes to recover the entire application will change. So what needs to be changed with it to still achieve the business requirement that they gave to you? Can you get your backups from the storage environment? That's important, because if you have the backups that are sitting out there and all of a sudden the storage is not available for you to pull your backup from, what do you do? How do you recover from that point? Is your backup sitting in a cold storage or is it sitting in hot storage? How does that look for recovery times? Does that extend you out beyond what the business requirement has? Bare minimum recovery can often be very, very complicated. It needs to be tested out, and there's a lot of details that can happen with bare metal recovery that often just get overlooked or forgotten about or surprised by. So that needs to be understood and tested out to make sure that you can recover from things when you need it.
Okay. Now, is a simple tabletop exercise enough here?
No. You're going to do some tabletop exercises with the team to understand what needs to get done, but then you actually need to go and do it and prove out what the plan is. That needs to be documented and put together into a run book and then communicated throughout the rest of the team so everyone understands it and knows how to use it when the time is needed.
Okay. Now, as far as Rubrik goes, do you have anything to recommend there?
Yeah, let's go on to the next slide here, and we'll talk about how Rubrik can fit into this. So Rubrik is going to be a consolidated database platform. Everything, whether it's going to be VMs, databases, file sets, can all be into one platform, so everyone can put their backups into one centralized spot. Now, because of role-based access, we can also segment out people so the right people have access to the right data at the right time. With Rubrik, we also have the ability to do automated discovery and protection. So this way you're not constantly managing a backup platform. Rubrik is doing a lot of that discovery and protection automatically for you. So as you add databases, we automatically protect them. As you drop databases, we stop protecting them without any errors or additional management overhead on your part. Live Mount is a great feature to help deliver near zero RTOs by still keeping the DBAs in control, and it also facilitates things like self-service clones. You can use Live Mount to test out your backups because a Live Mount is a database recovery operation. It's just sitting on Rubrik storage versus your storage. So you can verify your backup utilizing a Live Mount, go ahead and run a CheckDB against it, prove your database is both recoverable and not corrupt. It doesn't get you out of doing CheckDBs against your actual production database, but you get that peace of mind knowing that your database can be restored when you need it to be done. And because of our API first architecture, all of this can be automated and actually put into a process to get really good, fast iteration on that. So with Rubrik, we have the ability to do near zero RTOs with our live mount functionality. You can do full point in time recoverability. So either from the last full backup or to a specific point in time utilizing the transaction log backups. That's completely flexible for the DBA to go ahead and do. And you can go ahead and do backup verification in a multitude of ways. One, we do a verification on every write we do, but then you can do verifications back to your SQL server or your Oracle box or wherever by doing just straight restores or by utilizing the live mount, whichever way you want to go ahead and use.
We've covered quite a bit of material thus far, so we know what steps should be taken to prevent an attack and the resources we need to ensure recovery from an attack. But now let's talk about what we should be doing during an attack. Now, this joke is kind of blown, but let's hope the Borg haven't hacked your system. The fact of the matter is that breaches are going to happen. The key to minimizing the impact of the breach is really how you respond to it. So, Chris, what do you have to say for us with this one?
So, since we know bad things will happen, when the bad thing happens, regardless if it's from an external threat or an internal threat because someone went and purposely did a bad thing, or it was a mistake, the first thing you need to do is actually just stop and breathe. If you start acting before you have a chance to think, you're going to actually make things worse. So stop, breathe, stay calm, and take a second to think about what just happened and start asking questions. What are the affected assets? What's the blast radius? What went bad? What was currently good? If you understand your blast radius, now what are your recovery steps? Blast radius doesn't necessarily mean just the database. It could be databases. It could be multiple databases on multiple servers. It could be a bunch of file servers. What is it at a high level? And then what are the recovery steps for each items on that blast radius? Start thinking about doing like a targeted recovery. Like, do you need to recover the VM? Do you need to recover a file? Do you need to recover a database, a table, specific records? And when you understand what the blast radius is, now you can start to utilize your recovery plans. All that backup testing you did in the previous, we talked about in the previous section, well, those are all going to lead into your run books. When you've done your testing, you've documented your backup plans, your recovery plans. You now know what the steps are to do recoveries. Pull out the run book, start following the documents that you've already put together. With those recovery plans, because you've done the recovery testing, you know what the recovery times are. The reason why that's very, very important is because nobody wants to have hands on the keyboard while their manager's manager, or worse, the CIO standing over your shoulder saying, "Why isn't it done yet?" Having those recovery times in place, understanding what that is, you can now go ahead and say, it's going to take 3 hours to complete, and let them go away. And now you keep working on what you need to work on. That sets the expectations as well. What isolation do you need to do for the recovery? Should you just recover that thing back into the original location, or should you do some forensics on it to know if it's the right thing to restore? For instance, with a database, if you have a large database and you have to figure out when you have to restore back to, that could be a very long time to figure out, because you have to restore the database, which could be hours depending on the size of the database. Then you have to do your testing to figure out, is this the right one? And if it isn't, you have to do it all over again. Rubrik with a live mount allows you to do that in minutes versus hours, because now you can recover that database up really, really fast. Check out to see if the database is in a good state. And if it is, start doing the restore of your database back to the production server and go from there. From your recovery tools, what are your recovery tools? You have scripts in place? Do you have clean backups? Do you know where your backups are? Do you know where your scripts are and your tools are to recover that thing that needs to be recovered? Consider stopping operations during this situation that you're dealing with at that moment. Think about based on your blast radius and based on what's affected and understanding the environment, do you need to stop any operational tasks? Do you need to stop backups? Do you need to stop any type of deletion of data? What do you need to do? And start putting in those steps to prevent the situation from getting worse. Communication is going to be very, very critical. And I mentioned this earlier in the slides well, and I want to emphasize this again, is that when you're putting all these test plans together and you're doing all of this recovery planning, you're communicating this out with the other teams, and those other teams, from an option-wise perspective, is known by everyone, from the help desk person all the way up to the CIO. They don't necessarily need to know all the intricate details of how to do the thing that needs to be done, but they should at least understand the options that are available and where runbooks are, so this way people can go ahead and start using them.
Okay, and this sounds very similar to, say, how an elite athlete might train. You need to know what you need to do for work. You need to work with the tools you have, and you really need to practice it until it becomes muscle memory. But what happens if there's something inherently wrong with how you train?
That's with what we talk about next with the postmortem. So when things go wrong, you're going to, while you're dealing with that situation, you should be thinking about what happened, what went well, and what went wrong, what proactive steps have failed, meaning all the stuff we talked about in the beginning of the session. Did anything there fail? Or did something else fail? Did tools fail? Did you not get notified enough? Do you not have the ability to do the recovery with the tool that you're using? What procedures failed? Is your runbook inaccurate? All these questions, all these things that you're going to deal with in a post-mortem, you're going to take a hard look at them and decide what needs to get changed and where. Because there is not an athlete on a planet, to use your analogy, Shawn, that hasn't made changes to their training regimen once they've not gotten the results that they've expected. Just because you put the plan together once doesn't mean it shouldn't adapt over time based on new information that you've gotten or new results that you've gotten.
Okay, so let's recap here, Chris. I want to make sure that we've got key takeaways covered. A lot of great content in this session, and a couple of the big things that I think I've got is we really got to work with our organization's security team in an effort to prevent a breach. It really isn't realistic to think that you can stop every attack vector. You need to ensure that you protect your critical assets and you have a mechanism to return them to service quickly. And lastly, panicking under stress is our worst enemy. Having the plan isn't enough. You need to be able to execute the plan regularly and revise it when you discover shortcomings. Really building a comprehensive response plan ensures that all participants know their role and what they need to do. Testing this plan in a controlled fashion really enables everyone to understand what is truly expected of them. So that way, when it comes execution time, everybody knows what they need to do. They're not stressing out about it. Now, over the course of the presentation, we pointed out some of Rubrik's unique features for database protections. And the fact of the matter is most of us are DBAs here, not really salespeople. So here's an opportunity to review what Gartner had to say about Rubrik. Feel free to download the complimentary copy from the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We've got the links in the session notes. And again, this year, of all the solutions, Rubrik ranked the furthest to the right for completeness of vision. You'll also notice, if you take a look at this, that we're getting a lot of nods for how our database protection is actually a strength. Resources and next steps. If you want to get a little more product detail, recommend keeping an eye out for some of our virtual events. That way you can get your hand on the product and really see it in action. And we've got some additional materials that we've linked here, and I believe we're also linked in the resources for the presentation. So that way you can take a look and learn a little more about the features at your leisure. With that, Chris and I'd like to thank you for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please fire away. And I'm going to turn it back over to Scott at this point.
Thanks, Shawn. Yep, sounds good, and good stuff. Really, really interesting. Yeah, and as Shawn mentioned, everybody, this is your chance to get your questions answered by some real experts. So we're going to open it up for questions. I have a couple of them in here already. One of them, and Shawn, I'll pose this one to you. They're asking, we see auditors once a year. How does working with them, assuming they're willing, help us in our day-to-day activities?
Okay. For me, I came from my last gyration as a DBA, I should say, before I came over to Rubrik, was in the DoD Intel space. So yeah, you're going through audits, almost as much as you do in the financial sector. What the auditors would baseline off of is essentially a lot of what NIST provides. So if you look at that, and they provide what's called a series of STIGs, which you're going to ask me what the acronym stands for, and I'm not going to remember what it is off the top of my head. But essentially, what it boils down to is it's a punch list. And it says, okay, here's things that we're going to look for. You're running this database, this release of it on this platform. Here are things that we expect to see. And if we don't see them, we're going to flag it as a problem. If we do see them, your green light. And if you're somewhere in between, where let's say you're only able to implement part of the solution because of, like what Chris said earlier, maybe there's exceptions to the application configuration that prevent you from implementing this. You add notes to it to say, hey, yeah, here's exactly why we can't do this. You have that, and it gets updated on a regular basis. And now you've got, to go with what Chris was saying earlier with the run books, you've essentially got a run book for your audit. So now you can say, all right, here's exactly what I need to know. And you can go to your internal team and say, hey, does this match and look good for any upcoming audit? Or are there things here that we really need to reassess because our configuration currently won't support it?
Gotcha. And I'm not going to put you on the spot about that acronym, spelling it out, but what was the acronym again that you were talking about? Was it like STIG?
It's called a STIG. STIG.
Okay, great. So we can all Google that later.
I believe it's Systems Technical Implementation Guide, if I remember correctly.
Oh, all right.
It might be Security Technical Implementation Guide.
Great. This next one is about DR exercises. So we conduct disaster recovery exercises annually. It takes weeks to work through it. It keeps us from getting important work done. Are you telling me I should push to do this more often?
Well, that's a loaded question. The short answer is yeah, you should. But the fact of the matter is if you look at a DR exercise, you can break it down to individual components, right? There's the big thing to try to do is to try to break down everything into manageable pieces, like that whole concept of how do you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. So if you can say, all right, here is through a tabletop exercise, all the components that I need to run through for a DR exercise. Now I can say, all right, well, let's take a look at these particular pieces and ensure that the process is working properly for them. And then here's another set at another point in time that we can run through. And then as you really start fine-tuning those processes, now all of a sudden it's going to be, oh, when we do these exercises, we can start doing more and more and more in them, until you get to the point in time that actually running a DR exercise isn't this painful, god-awful experience that you've got to go through.
Keep in mind, Shawn, one other thing to add to that is DBAs are often asked to do environment refreshes. Take a production copy, put it into a non-production copy. That is testing a backup. Because if you have to restore that production database into a non-production environment and you have to do it often, you're doing that testing already as part of your day-to-day job. It's just not going to be in the view or the lens of a whole DR exercise that we're talking about here.
Exactly. And the other cool thing that I really like on the Rubrik end of things is the live mount feature, because that enables you to really test out a process, and ensure, do my backups work in minutes, instead of hours or days to try to get through a recovery.
All right, great. So we probably have time for one more. This question comes from Ash. What mitigation mechanisms during downtime would you suggest? In his example is, say there's a major patch being applied and an upgrade is taking place. How do we ensure attack prevention when resources are already undergoing downtime procedures? Any thoughts on that one?
That's actually a really good question. A lot of it's going to be based on how you've got your processes configured. And Chris, please feel free to jump in if you've got a different thought on this one. Because I look at it as a CI/CD kind of environment, continuous development, continuous integration. So you're working on a set of code that you can refine to the point that an automated process is going to drop it into your production system in little to no time flat. So the potential for exposure is minimized. The trick is actually being able to get to that point. And if you're dealing with a 0 day, it's a heck of a lot harder to say, okay, well, we got to go and run this through every environment and make sure you beat out the 0 day. So that kind of response is going to be driven by your security teams and what they feel is going to be the most advantageous route. So if your security team says, yeah, you know what, we need to shotgun this across all our environments because this is a known 0 day exploit and we can't afford to be caught flat-footed on it, that's going to be how it plays out. Otherwise, being able to automate it through a CI/CD process to say, all right, let's get it tested, let's make sure it works, let's get it deployed, and follow that bouncing ball kind of mentality will get them released faster and will decrease your possible window for exploit.
Interesting.
Chris,
Chris? Yeah, anything you wanted to add, Chris?
No, you did a really good job with that. I don't know that I can add anything else.
All right. Well, I just wanted to say, Shawn and Chris, thanks for a great conversation. That was really, really interesting. Unfortunately, it looks like we're running out of time. You mentioned some of the assets, and I did want to put up the poll. I've had it up there for a minute or so. If you can go ahead and let us know if there's any resources that you'd like from Rubrik, they'll get those right out to you. And before we finish up, we do have one more piece of business. It is the prize drawing for the $300 Amazon gift card. And the winner of the gift card is Matt Baltz from Virginia. So congratulations to Matt. We'll be in touch with you to get you your card.
I didn't win? Darn.
You did not win. You were not eligible as a presenter. Sorry. Matt won, and congratulations, Matt. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Shawn and Chris for putting together a really informative presentation and for all their insights in the Q&A. Also like to thank Rubrik for making this event possible. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.